Gracias. A ver, I will speak in English, but yeah, so I'm happy to have the opportunity now as a new postdoc at EBD to kind of talk a bit about the work I did in the past, and at the very end of the talk also a bit the work that I'm planning to do with the Eleonora's falcon while I'm here for the next 2 years. So the main topic of my talk will be this guy, the European Honey Buzzards, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit about the Eleonora's falcons and show some of the data that I'll be working with. Before going there, I want to just take you through a little bit like how I ended up doing all this, because it's about 10 years ago now, in 2008, that a couple of friends and I ended up counting raptors in Batumi, Georgia. As most of you will probably know, like many raptors are very dependent on thermal soaring for migration. And this causes a lot of these birds to converge in overland flyways. You all know the convergence of birds in the Strait of Gibraltar. And there's a very similar pattern going on in Batumi, but at a very massive scale with more than 1 million raptors passing through there every year. So when we went there in 2008, it was kind of like a fun project, and we ended up counting then more than 800,000 birds. We reported it, and it became like a huge success with bird watchers. And that just got the ball rolling and got me into this whole line of research regarding raptor migration. The interesting thing, of course, being that, as I said, these birds are very dependent on thermals, but also very much using strategically wind conditions for their migrations. I like to say that they're kind of solar and wind-powered migrants. Many of them really rely on this kind of atmospheric energy rather than having to forage around the way, although there's of course some variation between species. And in Georgia, the situation is such that you have these high Caucasus mountains that meet the Black Sea coast and then the lesser Caucasus range here. And as raptors are going from Russia to Africa, it kind of causes them to converge into this very narrow bottleneck. Where we have been counting raptors systematically for more than 10 years now, and that's a project that I'm still involved in today. So it's basically systematic counts of birds where we try to collect as much information as possible about the birds as well, so not just counting species, but also looking at ages and sexes and whatnot. And just while you're standing there and watching this whole phenomenon unfold and watching all these birds migrate overhead, it's kind of difficult not to start asking questions about how the hell these birds actually learn these migration routes, how they find their way to Africa, etc. But also other things, like for example, how weather influences the migration of these birds. So one of the things, for example, that we see in Batumi is that there can be quite a lot of variation in the passage timing of species like the honey buzzards, for example. You can just see it happening when it rains, that they go down into a tree looking a bit miserable and waiting for the sun to come back to continue their journey. And we also know from the breeding grounds that this kind of effects might be quite important actually for their fitness and their breeding success. This is a picture from a nest in the Netherlands where this is not an adult and a chick, but it's basically 2 chicks. They usually lay 2 eggs, but one of the chicks with retarded growth. And that's something that we see is very much correlated to the arrival date of honey buzzards in the Netherlands. So if you look at the arrival date on the x-axis and you look at how many young eventually fledge from the nest, you can see that arrival date really has a strong impact on the breeding success of these birds. And so one of the things that might be a factor in there is actually the weather conditions that they encounter on migration that are influencing their arrival timing and ultimately their breeding success. So also from that perspective, it's interesting to try to understand better how these birds actually cope with that. And other things that I started wondering about already then is like how do ultimately these external factors like weather conditions and just innate differences between species interact to shape species-specific migration patterns, because you can see a lot of differences in the passage of birds in Batumi. So for example, these are lesser spotted eagles that are highly dependent on thermal soaring. They really cannot cross large water bodies, and very much dependent on overland migration routes. And if you look at juvenile and adult passage, if you separate the two, which is something that has actually almost never been done based on migration count data before, you can see that the juveniles in blue really synchronize their migration with the adults in red, if you look at the cumulative passage of the birds. And that also applies to some other species that are, so that suggests that that these birds are actually learning these migration routes through social information, that it's based on cultural inheritance. Although you also see a similar pattern in other species like harriers and falcons, where migration can be really synchronized between juveniles and adults. But then those species don't really depend on these overland detours, so it's not really clear how to interpret that. And then we have again another species like the abejero, the European honey buzzard, of which we know that they strongly depend on overland migration routes, but there's a huge separation in the timing of juveniles and adults of more than 2 weeks if we look at the passage. And indeed, like juveniles, there's hardly any juveniles passing. Of this more than 600,000 honey buzzards that can pass through Batumi every year, just about 10,000 of them are juveniles. So these juveniles are migrating over a broad front while the adults are really relying on these detours. And this also got me wondering about how birds actually learn the migration patterns that we can observe at these kind of watch sites. But of course, to be able to get to that, we're not going to really understand it by sticking to our little observatory in one small place along the entire flyway. We want to get like a flyway-scale perspective of the behavior of these birds, because of course the migratory behavior has evolved on a flyway scale. It's not just specific to these particular locations where we count the birds. So via, because of the project in Georgia, I got to know Judy Chamoun-Baranes, who was working with Willem Bouten at the University of Amsterdam. I ended up presenting about the Batumi project on a conference in Spain, and I told Judy that I was really keen to do a PhD on honey buzzard migration. And little did I know that she was looking for a PhD to work on honey buzzard migration. So that was kind of like a match made in heaven. Also because Judy had been doing very similar work based on migration count data in Israel, and so I ended up doing my PhD thesis from thermal to flyway at the University of Amsterdam. And so there I wanted to really get to this kind of flyway scale perspective of migration using GPS loggers, the UVA-BITS GPS loggers, which several of you are using as well. So it basically functions like it's just a GPS tracking device basically. It doesn't transmit data remotely, but you have to download the data when the birds come back. So it's important to mention that a lot of what I will show is based on successful birds. We don't know what the losers are doing basically, but it does offer a lot of opportunities to look at migration behavior at multiple scales, from really fine scales to larger scales, which is what I'll be showing a little bit, summarizing a bit for you today. And one of the first things that I actually looked at with this idea of weather influencing migration performance in the back of my mind was how do weather conditions actually, how do they help to explain the migration performance of birds? Because we know from the very common thread in the literature on migration is that migratory birds in spring, they want to breed and they are in a hurry to get back to their breeding grounds, so they will minimize the time of migration. They are in a hurry and make more effort, and therefore we see higher migration speeds in a lot of birds during spring migration compared to autumn migration. But then what I did was, okay, I just put these GPS locations at an hourly resolution across the flyway and considered the different regions along the flyway, so like Western Europe in pink, the Iberian or Mediterranean climate in dark pink, the Mediterranean itself in white, the Sahara in yellow, Sahel light green, tropical area dark green. And I annotated them with weather data, like you can do in MoveBank, but then MoveBank wasn't out yet, so we had to do some other work. But in any case, I annotated it with a proxy for thermal soaring conditions and wind conditions that the birds encounter along the way. And based on a simple linear regression model with these three variables, I could actually explain, so the observed variation in hourly speeds and daily distances of the birds, which are the solid box plots. I could predict the regional and seasonal variations in that, in the dashed box plots, simply based on these weather conditions, and fairly little variation remained that could be accounted for by any kind of seasonal difference in behavior, like the traditional migration literature tends to suggest. So weather is actually very important. And it's not surprising, of course, that this should be the case for a honey buzzard that doesn't stop to feed along the way and that depends so heavily on thermal soaring and on wind, but we still want to understand a little bit how that all works. So to do that, I looked a bit at the finer scale, because the UVA-BITS loggers have the advantage that you can record data at a very high resolution and design a measurement scheme telling the logger exactly where and when it should be recording that kind of data. And when you have that kind of fine-scale behavior data, you can actually start making comparisons with predictions from optimal migration theory. So there's this classical book by Colin Pennyquick called Modeling the Flying Bird, which you can basically make a model of a bird based on its weight and its size and its wing shape and whatnot, and try to predict how fast it should fly in order to achieve certain objectives. So the traditional objectives that we always see in the migration literature is time optimization, time minimization. So that basically assumes that if a bird can climb faster in a thermal, it can afford to glide faster and lose altitude faster when it's gliding, because even though it loses altitude faster by gliding faster, it can compensate for it by the strong thermals that it encounters along the way. Another perspective might be that the birds just want to minimize energy consumption and minimize risk. And one way they can do that is by trying to glide the longest distance possible between thermals. So that would be kind of a risk-averse strategy. And so I used these kind of models to make these kind of predictions. And then we gathered the data that we needed to actually confront the theory with real-life data. So we set up this sampling experiment where we basically told a bunch of birds to record half-hour bursts of high-resolution data at 10-second intervals twice a day across the entire flyway. So these are some birds coming on autumn migration from Spain into Morocco. These are the bursts of high-resolution data. So that's what it looks like when you go a little bit closer. You can really see the climbing events and the gliding events, distinguish those from each other, and calculate basically the performance of the birds and annotate it with wind conditions as well. And then you can start making predictions based on the climb rate in the thermals and the wind conditions that they encounter, how fast they should glide to reach one objective or the other, and then compare that with real data. And there's a bigger story behind it, but basically if in gray what I show here is like a risk-averse index. It basically indicates the higher the value, the more risk-averse the bird is behaving, and the lower the value, the more the more that the gliding speed seems to be close to the time optimal gliding airspeed. And what we basically see is that this seems to vary a lot throughout the flyway. So if you look at the latitude here, and an important factor in that is the quality of the thermals. So the birds are more likely to glide at airspeeds closer to the time optimal airspeed when the quality of the thermals is very good, when they can climb very fast. But very often the thermal quality is really not that good, and they will be compromising time optimal speeds for risk aversion, for maximizing their gliding distance. So it basically emphasizes that the behavior of these birds is, of course, much more flexible than it's not just like a basic instinct of time optimization all the way. No, these birds are really assessing their environment, making decisions based on the conditions they encounter at very small scales about how fast they should glide and what direction they should be gliding in. But then to understand better how those regional and seasonal patterns come about, it was worth to look more into how the birds are actually, how the route choice of the birds actually depends on weather conditions as well. Because what we see with a lot of the honey buzzards is that they tend to make a western detour over West Africa when they return during spring migration. So they kind of increase the total length of their migration compared to what they do on autumn migration. And that's a pattern that's very common among migrating birds all over the world, in fact. And it likely depends on wind regimes. So what we did here was to try to use a perspective of orientation behavior to try to understand how the birds are actually directing their trip relative to the wind conditions that they encounter along the way. And one thing that's very nice that we know about these adult honey buzzards is that they always go back to the same place for wintering, they always go back to the same place for breeding, and they always cross the Mediterranean via the Strait of Gibraltar. So we can say with some confidence that these birds know very well where they are going and that they know where these locations are. So we can actually classify orientation behaviors based on what they are doing with respect to those fixed goals that they have on their journey. So what you do is you have to imagine like a bird is here on its spring migration. The shortest possible route to the Strait of Gibraltar would be this. So let's say that if there would be no wind in the world, you would expect the birds to just follow the shortest possible route all the time. But then we see that normally the birds don't actually stick to the shortest possible route to that goal. They will usually deviate from it, and they can deviate from it with the wind direction, or they can deviate from it against the wind direction. And based on that, you can classify orientation strategies. So basically, the idea is that if the birds are moving away from the shortest route with the prevailing winds, downwind, let's say, they are over drifting, or let's say, or fully drifting. If they are really staying on the shortest possible route, even though there is a strong side wind, then they are compensating for that side wind to stay on the shortest possible route. And in other cases, they will be deviating from the shortest possible route, but against the dominant wind directions, in which case we would say they're overcompensating for the wind. And then you can actually classify these behaviors for every GPS point and plot that on a map, but that's a bit of a mess, so I try to look at it in a different way. This is for the spring migrations. So what is already quite evident is that there's a lot of drift and overdrift going on here in Africa. But to understand that in the context of the winds they encounter, we can actually split those lines up and look at the individual data points and split the map in two, and we put all the points where the bird was experiencing a wind that was blowing to the west on this map, and we put all the points where the bird was experiencing a wind that was blowing to the east on the other map. And what you can already clearly see is that in this section of the journey, for example, almost all the points are located on this map. So the dominant winds there are, the prevailing winds there are going from east to west. Whereas in this section of the journey, almost all the points are located on this map. So in almost all the cases, the birds were experiencing winds blowing from the west to the east. And we can also then look at that in the context of the actual wind regimes, because there's a heat map behind all these points. And what I did there is I basically calculated the number of days in the honey buzzard migration season that the wind was blowing towards the west or towards the east. So these heat maps are the inverse image of each other. And basically what you see is that for a big part of the journey, the birds are basically experiencing what you would expect them, let's say the wind conditions that they encounter along the way match the prevailing winds within the flyway, but the exception is here, where you can see this green dot in this sea of orange here, which basically means that this is in this restricted area in westernmost Africa. The birds almost on half or more of the days of the migration season can catch a wind that is actually blowing from the west to the east, which is also associated to winds blowing actually from the south to the north. So it's actually southwest to northeast. So that's actually giving, you can also summarize it in histograms here. So these are the wind conditions that the birds encountered in this part of the journey. These are the wind conditions that you find on average within the entire flyway of the birds. So the birds are clearly encountering winds that are more supportive for crossing the desert than they could by flying in another part of the flyway, so like further inland. And the other interesting part that we found is that at the start of the journey, the birds are actually overcompensating, so they're flying against the wind, but the winds are very weak here. The strength of the color indicates how strong the wind is. So here, at the start of the journey, they're spending a big portion of their time flying against the wind to get to the west. And so the interpretation we give to this is that these birds are actually anticipating on the fact that in this part of the Sahara, they can actually catch, or they are more likely to encounter a favorable wind for crossing the desert. Whereas if they would just be going downwind at the start of their journey, they would likely end up in this area here, where they would then have to fight the winds while they're across the Sahara, which is a very risky strategy, because if you get stuck in bad winds across the Sahara, you might get tired, and you don't really have landing opportunities or opportunities to refuel. So the birds, the seasonal detours seem to be matching these kind of predictable wind regimes that we can see across the entire flyway. Again, there's much more detail to this than I can show here, but I have to kind of summarize it all in a short talk. I just want to emphasize that besides these wind conditions, it's of course important to take into account other factors as well. I can illustrate that based on these tracking data for a couple of honey buzzards that were tracked for several years. So the female and the male depart on autumn migration around the same time. But like many migrant birds, the couple doesn't stay together. In fact, there's a huge separation between the two as the female goes all the way to Angola during the wintering season. And then in April, they start their return journey, and the male, in this case, did it quite easily. He just encountered conditions as usual. But this female started flying all over the place. And at first, when we were looking at these data, we didn't really understand what was going on. But then when we looked at remote sensing data, we saw that she was actually stuck in a dust storm, which pushed her all the way to the coast of Mauritania, where she had to recover for a week or two before she could restart her migration. And even though honey buzzard pairs are very faithful to each other, they really are good partners, birds only have limited patience as well. So this guy had another girlfriend by the time she arrived. All the other males in the area were taking as well, so she basically lost her breeding season because of this bad weather event along the way. But there's like some poetic justice in the sense that the guy got eaten by a goshawk that year. So all is well in the end. And the female returned the next year, and started breeding again with another male. Anyway, these are clearly very complex strategies, very flexible behaviors that these birds have, which together with the differences in migration patterns that we see between species, as I said in the beginning, really makes you wonder, like, how the hell do these birds learn this? Is this really just a matter of genes? Or is it a matter of social learning, of birds learning from each other? Because all these honey buzzards traveling together might learn how to migrate from each other. And that's kind of like the classical the dichotomy that you will find in a lot of the literature from the 20th century. Nature versus nurture, genes versus culture, where it's often said, like, okay, passerines, they migrate at night, they are alone, even though many of them are communicating with each other. But passerines don't do social learning, it's all innate, it's all built in the genes, and they are just migrating on instinct. And then we have other cases like the geese or the swans, where of course we know that social learning is hugely important. And translated to raptors, you can see some indication of this as well, like small falcons that are, or big falcons like Eleonora's falcons, are broad front migrants. They learn everything by themselves, mostly based on instinct. Big birds like eagles and vultures, they don't travel in family groups, but they're still learning from each other how to migrate by traveling in these big flocks. But then you have these weird guys like these honey buzzards that you don't really know where to put them in, because as I showed in the beginning, the juveniles don't migrate together with the adults. They use a completely different strategy, so they have to learn these strategic detours sometime later in their life. And for a long, long time, this has been kind of a mystery, and people just assumed, like, okay, the first autumn migration, they're not able to get big quick enough to migrate with the adults, and then when they come back to Europe for the first time, then they will go together with the adults and they will learn the strategic routes, and all is well, and they can start breeding. But there might be, of course, a spectrum of behaviors that are all interacting with each other in developing these strategies. And I think with tracking data, we can also really start to get at some of these issues. So one of the things that I did as a freelancer after my PhD was to work with Patrick Biholm at the University at Novia University of Applied Sciences in Finland, where he had also been tracking adult honey buzzards, a small number, for some years. And the interesting thing already that stood out was that there was more variation in that population in the routes that different individuals choose, and also differences between the seasons in the routes that they choose. And variation is, of course, super interesting. So it was kind of an interesting system to get into. But what was very nice is that Patrick had also been tagging more than 30 juvenile honey buzzards with satellite transmitters and GPS GSM loggers, to actually try to understand what's happening to these birds on their first migrations. So this is an example of two siblings from the same nest. Both of them were tagged since after 2011, I think it was. And together with many other individuals. So I basically started applying some of the knowledge I gathered from my PhD on these juvenile tracks and associated the tracks with the wind data from these global reanalysis models. And here I colored the tracks according to the strength of the longitudinal wind that the birds encountered on the route. So the redder the track, the more the wind was blowing to the east, and the bluer the track, the more the wind was blowing to the west. So you can intuitively already see a very clear association in the direction that the juveniles are flying and the direction of the wind that they encounter along the way. And it also seems to interact with geography. So like when the birds depart from Finland on their first migration, the bulk of the birds experience eastward winds on their departure, and they will leave Finland across the Gulf of Finland. But some other birds encounter westward winds, and all of those tend to cross across the Baltic Sea directly or through Scandinavia, which means that by the time they reach latitude 55 north, they're already more than 1,000 kilometers apart. So that's a huge spread, a much bigger spread also than you can account for by individual differences in orientation between these birds. So that suggests that the winds are overriding any kind of innate difference in orientation between these juveniles. And that also applies for further along the route. So then what I did was, I basically tried to explain the longitudinal speed of the birds as they move from north to south in relation to the longitudinal wind speed, and I also plugged in the latitudinal wind speed as a proxy for headwinds and tailwinds. And we could explain the variation in longitudinal speeds of the birds quite nicely just based on these wind conditions. And I then colored the points according to their residual values, so according to model fit. So if it's very red, it means the bird is moving to the east much more than you would expect based on the model. And if the points are blue, it means that they are moving to the west much more than you would expect based on the model. And basically what comes out is that across most of the flyway, the model fit seems to be quite equal, but there is this kind of hotspot in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean where birds are sometimes doing something else that in many cases we don't really know why it is. In some cases we do, like this bird, for example, crossed the Mediterranean at night, ended up being taken westward by sitting on a ship for the whole night and then continued its journey after that. So there's we can clearly associate cases of poor model fit with some of these stochastic events. But overall, if we integrate the wind conditions that the birds encounter across the whole journey, and we try to predict their longitudinal displacement between Finland and the place where they finally settle in Africa, we can see that we can do that really well actually based on the wind conditions. There are a few birds, or like the birds with the biggest deviations, you can trace that back to events where they did something different than you would normally expect. So for example, Matti was a bird that left through Scandinavia even though the wind was blowing to the east when he departed. So that caused Matti to end up much further to the west than expected. But anyway, wind conditions and geography really determine where these birds end up settling in Africa, and not individual differences in orientation, which we also accounted for in these models using a mixed modeling approach. Then the nice thing is, like we know what the first autumn migration looks like, but what happens after that? What happens for the rest of their life? And the really cool thing with these honey buzzards is that we were able to track some of these birds for 6 years after they were juvenile. So we had like an opportunity to really try to look at how they acquire individual migration strategies. And what you see is here the first autumn migration. And so in the background you see the gray tracks are adults from Finland. So here you have the first autumn migration where you can clearly see the difference in timing between adults and juveniles. And then variability kicks in a way that I didn't really expect before starting this study. So what we do see is that there's a big wave of mortality in Africa. For several of these cases, we actually got it confirmed that the birds were shot or something like that. In some cases we don't know, but we interpreted this based on like whether the quality of the signal was decreasing or not before the signal was actually lost. So we are quite confident that most of these are real mortality events. The ones that we don't really know what happened are indicated in triangles, and those tend to occur more like after 4 years. We had 3 cases where we really didn't understand why the transmission was lost. But in any case, quite some mortality here in Africa. But then a huge variation in when the birds actually return for the first time. So we do know that second calendar year honey buzzards rarely occur in Europe, so that was no surprise. But normally we would expect them to all come back in their third calendar year. They attain their adult plumage that year, so you expect them to be sexually reproductive and to try to come back and settle a breeding site and start breeding for the first time. But in fact, what we see is that only half of the birds that made it to the third calendar year tried to come back in that year. The rest waited until their fourth calendar year, and one of them even waited until its fifth calendar year before it attempted a return journey to Europe for the first time. Also, what we see is that half of the birds during their first return migration die over the Sahara or at the Mediterranean. So we can see that here in light blue are those first spring migrations. You can see the dots here in the Sahara. For some of these birds, again, we were able to retrieve the carcass by just contacting someone in the country to go and look at the location. In other cases, it was just very clear, like these 2 birds that just ended up at the Mediterranean coast in adverse wind conditions, because in spring the birds face more headwinds than they would in autumn. Remember from the wind regimes that I showed before. That also applies to this section of the flyway. So basically what's happening is that these birds seem to be returning roughly northward from wherever location they first ended up in sub-Saharan Africa, where they first settled. They do move around a lot in Africa before their first return migration, but they all go back to roughly the same location where they first arrived after their first autumn migration. And then from that location, they try to get back roughly northward. There are some big deviations, like this curly-whirly here, but also that, again, you can clearly see that this is related to extreme wind conditions that they encounter along the way. So it's basically just depending on where they ended up in Africa, that's from where they try to go back to Finland. And some birds are lucky enough to end up in a feasible location to do a sea crossing, and others are not so lucky and just die and get removed from the population. So that then when you look at the birds when they're experienced, so from their second autumn migration onwards, we can see that the migration routes actually match this discrete pattern of different flyways being used by the adults quite closely. Now, there's a bit more to it, because there's a lot can happen to these individuals as they age and gain experience. But mainly what we see is that the birds that we were able to track for a longer period of time, they roughly repeat what they did on their first autumn migration or on their first spring migration. Unfortunately, in the case of Jana, she ended up in a severe dust storm in her fifth calendar year, and ended up being found dead under a bush in Mauritania. So it's like unfortunate that for some of these birds we weren't able to confirm these kind of patterns for a longer time series. Others, they show it very clearly as well, like Senta, but there is still a lot of flexibility going on, and that's something that we don't really understand. I haven't been able to relate this to wind conditions, so I think the most parsimonious explanation for that is that on their later autumn migrations, they are just sometimes making different decisions because they end up in a flock of birds that is going in a different direction, and they kind of trust the wisdom of the flock, let's say, in trying alternative routes. So like Senta, on her first autumn migration, she made a big sea crossing. Then on her second autumn migration, she learned this classical detour around the eastern Mediterranean, repeated that in her fifth calendar year, but then in her sixth calendar year, for an unknown reason, she did something completely different again. But we suspect that might be due to social information, because based on individual experience, she should clearly be able to learn this way. And then just to illustrate how drastically early life experiences can impact on birds, I think this case is just kind of mind-boggling. This is Mohammed. He was named after a guy that found one of our other birds in Nigeria. And Mohammed was tagged in 2013. First autumn migration ended up in Central Africa. This is the bird that stayed there until its 5th calendar year before making a first attempt to come back to Europe. Tried to come back to Europe, but also got stuck in these bad weather events that killed 2 of our other birds. But Mohammed was clever enough to say, like, fuck it, I'm not gonna go back. I'm not gonna go to Finland this year. I'm just gonna go back to Africa. And he was just wandering around East Africa for the rest of that year until the next spring in his 6th calendar year, when he departed from Africa at the same time as adults do, and he seemed to just join the flock and learn this traditional detour through the eastern flyway like many other birds do. And then interestingly, after his 6th calendar year, went back again to the place where he first ended up after his first autumn migration. So he didn't go back to that place where he was just hanging around for a year, but really that didn't disrupt his individual pattern, let's say. He remained faithful to what he learned based on his earliest life experiences. So I think these kind of examples can show really neatly how early life experience are actually really fundamental in shaping these individual differences in migration patterns. And that when people often write in the literature like, okay, consistent individual differences are indicative of strong innate cues. So for example, like individual timing is often more individually repeatable than individual route choice in many studies that are then usually based on a single population that is mostly using the same flyway. But then if you end up in this kind of system with really discrete possibilities for route choice, you see that these consistent individual differences can actually really emerge from early life experiences and don't necessarily have to be associated to innate differences in route preferences or anything like that. This of course raises a bunch of other questions, because why does it take them so long to actually learn to migrate? Because if we go back here for a minute, you can see that after their first migrations, the birds tend to have to stop over for a long time in Europe, and they only spend very little time in Finland compared to what the adults are doing. Like the adults directly go back to Finland to start their very short breeding season, but the juveniles, some of them, they arrive like in the beginning of August, hang around there for a week or two, and then have to go back to Africa again. That's kind of what's summarized in this table as well. So if we look at, for every return journey, what's the closest fix to the place that they were born, you can see that they will come to within 20, 40 kilometers from their birth site on the first return migration, but they gradually get closer and closer every year, and until they eventually start spending long periods of time, like in this case Lars, for example, in his 3rd year, spent 62 days at approximately 16 kilometers from his natal site, and the closest fix we got to his natal site was just 300 meters away. So what you see is that these birds are really, in my opinion, or in my interpretation, learning to migrate, and this simply takes them 2, 3, 4 years before they can do it well enough to arrive early enough to the breeding population and actually be recruited as breeders, which, by the way, we could confirm only for Mohammed. So Mohammed, in the 2nd time he came back, he departed at the same time as adults, and against all odds, this was the only bird for which we actually found a refurbished nest in the area that he returned to in Finland. So just goes to show how a likely loser can still end up being a winner amongst all of these birds. It's an interesting contrast with some of the other raptors. I'm not going to go into the lesser spotted eagle by lack of time, but in this case we see that the juveniles tend to learn the strategic detours already on their first autumn migration, and that they really do depend on social learning to do that. There is some discussion about it, but if anyone wants to talk about that more, I'll be happy to. But in any case, these birds learn their migration routes much faster. They also learn migration performance much faster, and therefore they also start breeding earlier than a honey buzzard does, which was a very surprising finding to us, because we really expected these birds to start breeding at 3-4 years of age. But then if you look at longevity records, you actually see that honey buzzards are more long-lived than lesser spotted eagles. So that might kind of offset the time, the extra time that they need to learn their migrations by individual learning compared to the more efficient learning process of these eagles that have more access to social information. Yeah, and, some other things to take away from that are, of course, that these traditional flyways, so the detours that, or the traditional routes that we see, like the one running through Batumi, apparently do not need to be learned through social information, but they can be learned through a stochastic learning process where individuals really rely on individual experience and chance to find their way through these routes. Even though it seems that they can benefit from social information later in life, the first routes that they learn are not socially inherited. So yeah, it really is an individual learning process. I also suspect that this kind of learning process might be more common than we expect, because many migrants have these very broad wintering ranges within Africa. So there's not really a very strong geographical constraint on where they have to go. So they could actually tolerate this big influence of early life experiences like the winds they encounter on their first migrations. And this has actually been argued to be a common model by people like Will Creswell and Tom Finch, where they say like, okay, very often in migrant birds we see very low migratory connectivity, so birds that were born close to each other spreading out across huge areas, and a lot of overlap between populations. And that this could be the result of such a learning process, as I think the honey buzzards demonstrate as well. And in like an evolutionary context, it could also make sense in the sense that there's more, that this kind of process could allow for rapid adaptation to environmental change, as there will always be some birds that learn the routes that are most suited for that moment in time, let's say. But I think that's something that through modeling exercises we could start to get more closely to that, although there are already some published papers where they show that this kind of stochasticity can really be beneficial, let's say, or help to maintain resilience to global change in migrant birds. Okay, so that's the honey buzzards, a big part of what I've been doing over the last year since I started counting birds in Batumi. And now I'm here in Spain, and very happy to have the chance to work with these magnificent creatures, Eleonora's falcons, in a study system that Laura Gangoso set up, and in the group of Jordi. So we're basically working with a population in the Canary Islands, situated here, and other Eleonora's falcons populations are, or the species, let's say, is really an island breeder. It mainly occurs throughout the Mediterranean, and then here in the western of the coast of Morocco and on the Canary Islands. And the interesting thing is that they have these really, they're colony breeders. They breed in colonies in these very specific locations. And then from all these different colonies, all the birds gather in northern Madagascar for the non-breeding season, which is kind of a really funny migration system. And besides that, they also have a very remarkable timing, in the sense that during the breeding season they raise their chicks by feeding them migratory passerines. So their breeding season is actually in the autumn, when the passerines are migrating from Europe to Africa. So their whole annual cycle is shifted quite remarkably with respect to other migratory species. And then they have this rather specific target area that they need to get to. Although even within that very restricted wintering range, we still see consistent individual differences in the areas that they use, suggesting there could still be some room for, let's say, early life experiences in generating these kind of individual differences. There's also been previous studies mostly based on satellite tracking data from different populations. So for example, Sardinia, but also the Balearic Islands, that in the first place showed that the old theory, and then we're talking like, I don't remember the year exactly, but for a long time it was thought that Eleonora's falcons would just follow the sea and then go through the Red Sea, follow the east coast of Africa to end up in Madagascar. But in fact, what was shown with the satellite tracking studies is that they use quite individually different migration routes that go all across Africa, directly crossing the Sahara and then through East Africa into, from Mozambique into Madagascar. And what we see in our data is also that there are, even within our population, remarkable repeatable individual differences in route choice. So for example, this individual in khaki green here consistently crosses the Sahara on its return migration much further east than most other individuals that tend to go west and make stopovers here to then cross the Sahara along a route similar to the one that the honey buzzards are using. So there seem to be different strategies between these individuals, but also some convergent patterns in the sense that almost all the birds go to the same stopover site here in the Horn of Africa on their spring migration before they cross the desert. And the learning process for this remains largely unknown. We do know that juveniles on this map follow a very different migration pattern than adults from the same population. So it suggests that these birds are not learning from adults like honey buzzards, but are somehow learning to improve their migration schedules with age and experience. And unfortunately, this is a process that I won't be able to tackle through my postdoc. I think it is useful to keep in mind how it could be also related to early life experiences when we go about interpreting the data. But I think there are nice opportunities to actually combine the data from these multiple populations where birds have been tracked to look at the whole system from a multi-population perspective, where we see that some hotspots are really, there are clear hotspots in stopover locations. So the Horn of Africa, for example, in spring, here in Nigeria, Mali, in both spring and autumn migration, and that these areas are used by birds from multiple populations. In fact, some preliminary analysis suggests that we get birds from different populations at the same day within a few kilometers from each other within the Horn of Africa, for example. So I think there's really neat possibilities there to look at how these seasonal migration routes are actually configured to make use of particular resources that are available at these places at the time of year that the falcons are there. And we could try to tackle this with a remote sensing approach, so trying to look, for example, with NDVI at productivity. The Horn of Africa is known to be a very important stopover sites for many migrants, to the point that if there's a drought in that area during the spring migration period, it can severely delay passerines. So this was recorded, for example, for red-backed shrikes and thrush nightingales from Sweden, that in 2011 they had an extremely late arrival and most of them failed to breed because they were delayed in the Horn of Africa. So I suspect that also for the Eleonora's falcons there is some emergence of resources for a short period of time that they very heavily depend on, and that this in a big part shapes their spring migration journeys. More recently, Gabriel Norevik showed for pallet swifts that their arrival date to certain areas in Africa was very highly correlated to the end of the rain season. So when the rain ends, shortly after that, insects will emerge, and these pallet swifts are staying there for some weeks, and then when the vegetation starts drying out again, they leave shortly after that. So these birds seem to be tuning their movements in relation to rainfall patterns, and that's another factor that we might be looking at in these models for trying to figure out why the falcons are stopping over in the places that they do. Another thing that I was thinking about could be of relevance is wildfires, but also deliberate fires by shepherds, especially in the Sahel, that are burning large parts of the large areas, and during those events many insects and termites and stuff will emerge. We know from visual observations that other falcon species like hobbies and red-footed falcons and amur falcons, but also lesser spotted eagles and black kites can gather in the hundreds, if not thousands, at such a fire to make use of the insects that are emerging from there. And given the seasonality of these fires, I suspect that might play a role for the Eleonora's falcons as well. And these different factors might be contributing to a different degree in these different stopover regions. So that's, let's say, the big project that I want to look at over the course of the next 2 years, and I hope to make good use of the remote sensing expertise at EBD to be able to do that. And in addition to that, I won't dwell on it much, but I've also been doing some analysis already where I used this same classification of orientation behaviors with respect to the wind conditions that the birds encounter on the route to try to get a better handle on how predictable wind regimes are actually shaping these seasonal differences in migration routes, but always keeping in the back of my mind that these tracks, for example, all belong to the same individual that consistently does something different than other individuals. So I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around how would be a good way to sort of integrate that together into a more coherent story. But in any case, what comes out so far is that the birds seem to be following the shortest possible route between the Canary Islands and Madagascar for almost the entire autumn migration, except here when they deviate more southward to get with wind support. And also here where they seem to be avoiding flying over the Congo forest, presumably because it's a barrier with little resources available to them. And then in spring we see a very different pattern where we have this very long longitudinal migration across the Sahel, and then birds making different decisions about where is the best place for them to cross, which I suspect is due to the fact that they're stuck in a habit that they learned early in life, which I won't be able to prove because I don't have the longitudinal tracking data to show it. But I think like keeping the whole process of the honey buzzards in the back of my mind, it will be possible to sort of suggest hypotheses at least for some follow-up research if I decide to stay for longer than 2 years. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and if you have a question, I'll be happy to take it.